Chapter 230, Training Hall, Part 2. Althea looked at the monster in the eye, staring it down. Don't look at it being a level lower than her. Monster's physique was something fragile humans could not compare with. Not to mention, for physiques, level 5 was a threshold for monsters. Unlike before, where every level up would have a bit of an increase in stats, every 5 levels would have a somewhat higher increase. Since this applied more to monsters, it spelled more trouble for them. Without warning, the creature lunged forward at incredible speed, its claw clashing through the air. She shifted her weight and avoided it, and the creature emitted a low growl, dissatisfied with its miss. She took out a normal level E bow and arrow, ready to strike. She did not want to be dependent on overpowered weapons to fight, especially since she couldn't maximize it with her low level. Personal skill was still the best bet. Not to mention, even if she wanted to use her overpowered weapons, she wouldn't be able to. This was because there was also a limitation of allowed weapons inside. For level 1 training halls, up to D-class weapons were permitted. She immediately activated her skills to increase her chances. Perfect aim, -10 mana. Quick shot, -5 mana. The monster quickly turned and lunged towards her, showing great flexibility. She deftly maneuvered behind the creature, sending a flurry of quick strikes at its weak spots. She jumped back as it lunged forward, kiting it, and she used her skills many times to cause heavy damage. She couldn't help but recall her first days with her gun. A level E bow and arrow was on par with it in terms of damage, and she could only marvel at the magic of this world. At the same time, she wondered, if their weapons makers could somehow produce guns, how powerful would they be? Anyway, she wasn't able to dwell on this as the monster roared from the bottom of its stomach, and she felt a little vibration in the room. Enraged, the monster thrashed around, very quick and very strong. Althea barely avoided its strong jaws, but she didn't avoid its paws, and she was thrown meters away. The giant rat jumped to maul her, and she rolled over to avoid it. She did manage to, thankfully, avoid a bulk of its attack, but its tail suddenly turned and struck her, causing her to lose her balance just as she regained it. The monster naturally went to take advantage of her imbalance, but she was quick to get in an attacking position, even while lying down. Down on the ground, she quickly shot several arrows in a row, hitting its mouth and even its uvula. Ruza! Its body shook in pain, trying to take out the few arrows that got stuck in its mouth. Taking advantage of its distraction, Althea quickly jumped on her feet, avoiding its heavy paws wildly flailing about, and began continuously shooting again. She jumped sideways to avoid the monster's massive teeth, somersaulting to regain her balance, and using her legs to zoom back to the monster. At this time, she took out her improved katana, courtesy of Eugene and Brenda, now capable of damaging a level 5, for a change of pace, mostly for her own more balanced training. The two fought for several rounds, most of which were close calls. There was one time that she almost got bitten, but she used her legs to hit the side of its face, redirecting its bite. Such a strong and fast opponent was intrinsically superior in close combat. She naturally sustained some damage. She looked at her stats and saw that her life and spirit were reduced by a third. Tusk, sure enough, the level wasn't everything. In the training hall, one's life and spirit were duplicated. Even if you lost either, you would not die. However, she heard in the end the real body will still lose spirit, and depending on the damage, the remaining points may just be enough to keep one's life. Soon her 10 minutes were up, and she had to reactivate her skills. Perfect aims, mana. In a blur of motion, the monster darted toward her, its claws and fangs poised to strike once more. Her lithe movements eventually adjusted, breaking its former stiffness and matching with the creature's speed. With calculated precision, she slashed her katana, narrowly missing its agile form. Quickly, she transitioned and placed the katana back in her space. She swiftly strung her bow, eyes fixed on her fast-moving target. With as much focus as she could muster, she quickly released the arrow, then again and again. She hit its weaknesses like the eyes and the neck, giving it some damage. She eventually found the pattern of its movements, but unfortunately, her reaction time wasn't fast enough yet, causing her to receive a bit of damage. But in time, her expertise and timing neared perfection, and she started causing more and more damage as time went on. Splack! The monster roared in pain after an arrow buried in his eyes, right at its iris. It was at this moment she suddenly heard a familiar ding in her head. Congratulations, perfect aim skill LV1 has leveled up. Her eyebrows rose. Some skills were upgradable the more they were used. It seemed like this skill was one. Perfect aim D level 2. 100% hit rate for targets less than 20 meters, lasts 15 minutes. Consumption, 10 mana. In this short time of days, the monster had finally recovered from its agitation, and their eyes met. Immediately, the damned thing lunged back in her direction. The two of them continued their previous fights, though Althea was notably no longer being pushed around. It still wasn't easy though, as she wasn't able to avoid its tail grabbing her legs and pulling her down to her back. Bang! She took out her katana, swiping the tail continuously as she used the blade to block his teeth. Eventually, she had to use her own legs to push down its glomping as she stabbed its tail. With a roar, it finally let go, and her feet barely avoided being mauled. She quickly recovered and shot several more arrows using her upgraded skill. She unleashed a barrage of attacks on the monster, each shot connecting with its mark. The creature finally stumbled, and using her katana, she finally drained its health bit by bit. She soon ended its life with several slashes. At less than 30% of life left, she watched it finally fall down. She watched its image disappear, much like the ashes of the buildings in royal territory before. When everything was gone, her legs gave way, and she also found herself on the ground, gasping. Medicine and other healing agents were not allowed to be used in the training hall, aiming to push the individual to the limit. Oh, she was being pushed all right. You still have 0, 0, 24, 14 left. Would you like to continue? She stared at her little digital life left and narrowed her eyes. After a short breather, she raised her graceful finger. Yes. Yes, of course, this wasn't enough. This was something she realized with sharp enlightenment after this fight. She was still too weak. Vismont. Later that day, the sale continued in Vismont village, but this time they set up a stall near the village center, with the richer population as the target market. They had decided on the location, with the agreement of the so-called Lord, based on efficiency. More importantly, the Lord was right next to them, and this alone immediately gathered the attention of everyone around as soon as he was noticed. The group settled down, setting up under the illumination of the torches, and they were quite crowded even before everything was set up. They took out 1L jars of various condiments to wholesale, bags of flour, bolts of cloth, and sewing tools, all sold in gold. People started their endless inquiries as soon as they appeared. One of the first things to notice was the bluish-green fine powder that was sold in kilogram bags. Matcha, the first in line, asked, and the seller smilingly shook his head. No, it's flour. Flour? Other people focused on the other things, recognizing it. Rice, one asked, why is it blue? Both flour and rice are local materials. They naturally look different. Rest assured, our experts have determined they are healthy and safe. He cleared his throat and taught them some trivia that they got from the grocery store clerks. The wheat here developed chlorophyll pigments, making them packed with more vitamins and minerals. It also has more antioxidant properties. Rice is blue because it has loads of iron, magnesium, and zinc coming from the rich soil. Very good for immunity and bone strength. In any case, our territory has been consuming it for a while, and it has been only good for us. Wow, how does it taste? More and more people asked, and the Alterans, ready for such questions, took out free taste samples of everything, be it the sauces, the condiments, the cooked rice, or the baked bread. Without exception, those who tasted had bright eyes. Their little doubt washed away by the taste. Wow, it's almost the same. Delicious. This is amazing. If we add this sauce to the restaurant gruel, it would improve its taste 100x. I, on the other hand, wouldn't eat that joke of a gruel with rice and wheat now available. This marketing naturally got the trust of the people, desperately wanting to believe they were real. The crowd got bigger and bigger, and the Alteran guards started imposing the organized lines because the people here were pushing each other. Fortunately, the crowd in this area was much smaller than that of the shanty areas, and were thus much easier to manage. The lines soon organized, and the people reluctantly lined up, hoping there were a lot of stocks for them. What are you going to buy? I can only choose one. Who told me to be so poor? My brother lent me some money so I can buy a bit of everything for the house. Wow, how lucky. Mitchell watched the commotion with a blank face, eyes looking at the lively faces of the crowd, with a mysterious expression on his face. They were standing not far from this crowd, along with his confidants. Next to them were Sylvia and the red-headed aborigine. Seeing the crowd, I wish I could buy more, he told them, eyes staying on Sylvia, who just smiled. Prior to their setup, he had already purchased a bit of all the products. While he tried to gain more for cheaper, he was only given a 10% discount on everything. The gangsters naturally spoke for him and demanded more, and the atmosphere got tense because of it. Mitchell barely managed to defuse the situation, and he had no choice but to take the small discount offered. Soon questions about the stocks and availability popped up. Are these really the last batch? Do you really have no more stocks left? Mitchell shifted his eyes to focus on the crowd, wondering how the shop owners would respond. At this question, the shop owners actually looked particularly excited, answering with subtle enthusiasm. This is indeed the last batch, one said, voice calm and a bit low, but his bright eyes betrayed the excitement he was feeling. However, you could get some in our territory, or wait for the next caravan to arrive. Mitchell's lips twitched. This line, who was deaf to hear its low-key goal of poaching. No, it couldn't even be considered low-key anymore. He sighed and just looked at Sylvia, who was giggling a bit. Do you produce them yourself? Yes, we had a famous plant expert in our territory. She not only studied the local plants, she also bought seeds from Terran. She paused. It is her team who was also responsible for processing the crops into what you see now. This made Matthew pause, a little shocked, while the others gaped shamelessly. He cleared his throat, returning to his composed self. I see, the person who made this is really amazing. Do you know them personally? This lord looked really amicable, but anyone with brains could notice the interrogative undercurrents. When Sylvia shook her head, he turned to look at the other less busy individual in the store. Crow and Leo answered with similar vagueness, because everyone else lacked the EQ to deal with Matthew. Eventually, the lord finally excused himself to do some official work, and got his people to warmly see him off. Sonny and Dog didn't even bother hiding their eye roll. Anyway, now that the creepy lord was gone, the atmosphere in the group lightened up visibly, and the joy of making money more pronounced. The selling continued, and the people, especially the twins, who had gotten very good deals thanks to their friendship with Ansel, had large smiles on their faces. Rich, they're really rich. A few more rounds of selling, and they would probably be able to buy their own house. After all, even if there was a deal between the two territories, their purchasing price would still be lower. They could create caravans and still sell these items for a very good price. No, there were down payment programs. With this money, they might be able to pay for the down payment as soon as they get back. At the latest, just one more round. It is amazing, they're amazing, the territory is amazing. Even with their parents there, their house in Terran was a rental. How proud Mom would be when they see them own a house. Should we buy a duplex or a single detached house? Leo asked dreamily, and Luke answered almost immediately. Mom loves gardening, a small one-side yard may not be enough. They looked at each other, eyes bright, and thought of their choice simultaneously. Single detached it is then. The twins continued to excitedly chatter about their new house, while selling for a while, interrupted when they felt an apprehensive stare directed at them. Leo turned his head abruptly with narrowed eyes and saw a familiar woman. But Leo was unsure because she was quick to turn around and leave. That's, Luke uttered. Leo knew that his brother had a better vision than he did, confirming that the woman was indeed who he thought she was. Their eyes met each other and they stood up, gesturing to follow the woman. After all this time, they finally had a clue. Before leaving, the twins asked their new friends and stall neighbors Sunny and Cassie to watch their stuff for them. After orienting the girls, they headed in the direction the woman ran to. The twins quickly weaved through the crowd in the direction of the woman. They ran purposely, expressions a mix of determination and urgency. They passed through crowd after crowd, alley to alley, house after house, trying to catch up to the woman. Unfortunately, even with Luke's superior eyesight, they still lost her. Damn it, Luke yelled with gritted teeth, while Leo frowned, his fists forming into fists. Why did she run? Luke said, mumbling bitterly, while Leo didn't speak. Yes, why would she run? There was no other reason unless. He shook his head, not wanting to think too much. Are you looking for someone, lads? An old man manning a clothing repair stall asked. The man looked at their clothes and nodded. Those must be made here in this continent, yes. Ah, yes. To promote their products, the main parties traveling were encouraged to wear new clothes from the newly produced cotton cloths. You could tell. Yes, most clothes from Terran are automated. There are differences in the stitches. I see, he said, and felt very good about this kind-looking old man, temporarily putting aside the issue of the woman. Besides, he could have seen something. You fix clothes for a living. The old man paused and chuckled. You can say so, yes. Since we don't have access to cloth, the people here could only make do with what they have. I happen to have fixed a lot of clothes in my youth. He paused, smiling. This is all thanks to the Lord that a useless old man like me could get a job. Luke was good friends with Sonny's group, so he naturally had some more knowledge about the ruling class here. He couldn't bear to let this kind old man be brainwashed so deeply. From what I heard, the Lord here is a bit shady, a politician who could get so much hard money and all. The man paused, only staring at them for a moment, and Luke felt a little guilty for trying to break other people's worldviews. Perhaps, the old man said after a moment, face adorned with a wise smile, but we don't deny that much of the reason we could live peacefully is because of him. Luke shrugged and just thought he was a lost cause. Leo, on the other hand, just paused with his words and didn't say anything else. Have you seen the woman we were chasing? She had a braided bun on her head. Leo asked. She's our mum's friend. She was with her when the disaster happened. The old man looked at them with wise eyes, as if determining if they were telling the truth. He closed his eyes and finally spoke. She lives with others a block from here, he said, pointing in a direction. The twins thanked the old man before heading their way. But as they walked away, they heard the old man say behind them, a reminder, things may not be as they seem. Leo's steps paused for a moment, but he shook his head. He had much more urgent matters to deal with. They sprinted with all their strength and reached a relatively sparse neighborhood outside the center. They were looking around and saw the woman about to reach a door. Lucky for them, the woman tried to mislead them by going in a different direction before heading home, saving them a lot of trouble instead. Luke used much of his strength to dart after the woman and finally caught up. He grabbed her arms, pulling her to an alley. "KYA," she yelled, but her mouth was quickly covered by Luke's large hand. They pulled her to a quiet location, and Leo stared at the woman with narrowed eyes. "Promise you won't scream or run, and we will not bind you." The woman was breathing heavily, wide eyes looking at them in fear. Leo's jaws clenched, while Luke was just annoyed. Are you going to help us or not? The shivering woman was silent, as if considering, and it took a while for her to nod. This hesitation alone made Leo's frown deepen. Luke, as promised, let her go. The woman gasped as she lost the feeling in her leg and almost dropped, only to be supported on each hand with separate arms. Luke immediately began his interrogation. "Auntie, why did you run? Where's Mum?" Leo tried to be as gentle as he could, in contrast to Luke. "Auntie, we just want to ask where Mum is." Leo watched the middle-aged woman pale even more at the question, shaking in fear. The more she didn't speak, the more their hearts dropped. Luke's eyes were turning red in impatience and annoyance, while Leo tried his best to stay collected. He stopped himself from panicking, big brain thinking of the many possible explanations. Maybe they parted early on. Maybe they cancelled their plans at the last minute. Maybe they didn't go to the supermarket in the first place. "Where's Mom?" She uttered but shut her mouth, looking at anywhere else but the two of them. Seeing her like this, their hearts stopped. "Where is she?" Luke couldn't help but shake her, already a tiny bit of patience wearing thin. She shook her head crazily, and Luke's vision started going red. "Where is my mother?" His bellow seemed to have made the woman snap. I didn't mean it," she yelled, completely losing her footing, covering her own ears as if she wasn't the one currently yelling. "She tried pushing me first." This made them freeze like they were thrown into iced water. "Lias," Luke roared. "I'm not, I swear," she sobbed, her arms covering her whole body as if she was in pain. Leo looked at the ground with a dark face, his hands freezing to fists, then loosened, then gripped again, awkward, not knowing what to think. Things are not what it seems, the old man had said. Perhaps it was implying that this woman was also a victim, but he just didn't want to believe it. Vismont. Nights in Zeno were quite dark, and nights in the small Vismont village were no exception. Here, only the main road was lit with torches, and still very sparsely at 100 meters apart. If it weren't for the 2 moons, people would basically be blind at night. On the side near the main plaza, the best-lit place in the territory, a certain group of top sellers were already packing up, but there were not a few people still lurking around, hoping they magically released more products. Anyway, the Ultron products have sold out, and everyone was very happy with the earnings. Rowan nodded and walked to Sylvia, the main proponent of interterritory relationships in the team. "What do you think?" he asked, referring to their next point of action. They weren't given the order to partner with Vismont, and although it wasn't prohibited, their party definitely wouldn't take the initiative for cooperation. He hoped to know the stance of the territory in case of accidents. "If they approach us with very advantageous deals while we're here, we may consider. Of course, if they're doing anything inhumane, then naturally there would be no partnership regardless of profit." Rowan nodded, and he looked around to find the people who had been here before, for more referencing. But as he did a head count, he noticed 2 people missing. "Where are the twins?" he asked, and it was the girls Sunny and Cassie who stepped forward to answer him. "They seem to have seen someone they know," they said. "They looked to be quite in a hurry." Rowan frowned and looked in the direction. He was a bit worried. After all, this territory was not nearly as safe as Althea, and the ruling class were forceful people who only sought to take advantage. This was actually the standard in most territories he knew of, but after a month in Althea, it was obvious how his view had changed. "I will look for them," he finally said, before turning to the Althean crowd. "I have already rented a few houses in Community C. Gather your bearings, and rest well. We will travel back on daybreak tomorrow." "Yes." Rowan found the twins an hour later after following a couple of clues. The 2 of them had dark expressions on their faces, looking uncharacteristically somber. This was unusual because these twins had been some of the most energetic people he had ever encountered. However, he did not ask. They weren't close enough for him to pry, and it seemed like they encountered a very personal issue. "I have been looking for you," he said, and the 2 looked apologetic. "We are sorry," they said, and he didn't nag them. Without anyone speaking, Rowan led them to one of the residences he rented for the team. It was the usual unit available, except that they had brought blankets from Althea to keep themselves somewhat comfortable. This was in contrast to the others, who probably only had a roof over their heads. They had seen how it was for most. They would be already better off than most if they brought a tent. The others barely had a shed built above their heads. While there were indeed carpenters in the territory, they were sadly not accessible to most. Anyway, their abode might be really bare and basic, but this was already a luxury for nearly everyone else in this village. He remembered when he and the other Ultrans saw the accommodation and frowned in distaste. This was until they belatedly realized that it was how the better-off people had been living. It was very impolite of them to complain so much. Some people were outwardly ashamed of how queasy they had become, but then became proud because their home was just so much better than others, spoiling them in turn. However, the twins didn't seem to notice the living arrangements at all, obviously dwelling in their own worlds with low moods. Before leaving the 2 to their own devices, Rowan gave them both a pat on their shoulders. "Just call if you need something," he said, and left without waiting for a response. Leo and Luke's eyes met, and they sighed, lying down on their respective blankets, directly on the hard cold floor below. But they were so numb, they didn't even feel it. Crow, Dog, and Sunny had a small house to themselves. Lighting up the protected torch in the rooms, they formed a circle in the middle of the room and sat. "What do you think he'll do?" Dog asked his friends. "Do you think he'll target us and our goods?" "He probably will. Be careful of his guards. They may find fault soon." "But they can't hold a candle to Rowan, could they?" "Who knows? Those people have such dark minds. Don't underestimate them." The group nodded in solemn moods, their heads wondering how to defend themselves from possible attacks from the snakes. At this time, there was a sudden knock on the door, startling them for a moment. When they didn't respond immediately, the knocking turned a little more urgent, followed by a familiar voice. "Sunny, Dog." That voice. They quickly opened the door to see their neighbor Auntie from when they lived here. She was very kind to them, one of the few people who didn't snarl at their group. Occasionally, she would even send them some fruits her son harvested. Their faces brightened at the sight of a friend. "Good that you came, Auntie. We actually kept some stock of our products." But Dog's soliloquy was stopped when the middle-aged woman gripped his arm with teary eyes, shaking in fear. "Please come with me, my son has fainted, and I don't know who to call." They frowned and immediately went with her to see. Bull scoffed. As expected of a hypocritical lord and his ruling class, people don't even look for them when there's trouble. The young men and woman looked at each other and nodded, coming after the woman to help her out. They had completely forgotten the defense strategies they had been discussing literally 1 minute prior. The group of 4 ran to a familiar slum area and to a small makeshift hut to see their old friend. To be honest, there was an element of smugness here, because they kind of wanted to show off how well off they were now, despite being so pitiful just a few days prior. However, what they got into was not the scene they expected. The son was indeed without consciousness, but on his back was a large foot owned by a huge man with a mocking smile. Beside him were 8 more people. They recognized a few as the guards from the entrance. Worse, they brought more manpower with them. Their hearts paused. "The boss wants your products," Brong said, chewing an Alteran jerky he had. He closed his eyes and savored its taste, and when his eyes opened, he just looked even greedier. Dog scoffed, glaring, even when his legs were a little shaky. "Heh, that lord finally lost his patience, eh?" Crow furrowed his eyebrows. His ego and success had flooded his head. So much for being a genius. And they really should have known better. They turned their heads to the auntie who was sobbing, not daring to look at them, and they were more certain in their hearts that this was a trap. Hey, of course it was a trap. Were they still in denial? Damn them for being stupid. Rowan was not with them now, and they were in the slums. In this place, no one went against these bastards at all. They don't know what happened with the first thousands of settlers of this territory, but they seem to have fear of these gangsters ingrained in their hearts. Obviously, if everyone banded together, they'd be able to fight these people off right. "Well, get out all the items you had in stock, as well as the gold you earned from our people." The 3's hairs rose in anger. "Dream." They yelled, and the big man cracked his knuckles in response. Without any warning, he sent the same knuckle into Dog's face. The young lad was thrown back, gasping with a bloodied nose. Dog, the others couldn't react immediately and could only run to him, lifting his head up. Brong and the others laughed at them, still not giving it to us. Sunny, whose eyes were tearing a little, held on to Dog, looking heartbroken before whipping her head to glare at Brong. "It seems you forgot you have no chance against our soldiers." This made the gangster pause, but only for a bit. Instead of backing away, they only laughed at her. "How many are you? How many are we? This is our territory. Didn't you know that the dragon still had to give way to the snake in its own home?" The trio paled. Indeed, the lord of a territory was extremely protected in their scope. They weren't sure if Rowan and the others could handle it. Even if they could, what if the lord kicked out Rowan and the other strong men? What would they, who could be left behind for free beating, do? The remaining goons quickly held back the 3 youngins, pulling them apart and hitting different parts of their bodies. However, they were not like before. They were much stronger and braver now, and they managed to turn it into a fight. Crow avoided a punch and kicked someone's shin, and Dog made a quick follow-up by headbutting the person. GYA. They took advantage of the momentum to damage another gangster. Of course, even if they improved their strengths and had a lot more fights in them, they were still no match for hard-skinned gangsters who fought for a living. "I see you got some fight in you," Brong said, but then more people stood up and it became 1 to 3. Very soon, all they could do was defend themselves and curl up like turtles. Some men also pulled Sunny away. She squealed and cried, with Dog and Crow yelling for her, but was pushed back violently by a flurry of kicks and punches. She wanted to vomit at the grubby hands touching her body, trying to get into her clothing. "No," she cried, but the hands only groped more hurriedly, and she looked around for help, only to see the others being beaten up helplessly. She was beginning to lose hope. She sobbed. "Someone, please." "Hee, no one would dare save you, silly girl," a man yelled, grabbed her face with his grubby hand. Sunny could only cry desperately as the man's hand crept down her shirt. However, before the disgusting hands could do anything else, the door abruptly opened, followed by a loud bellow. "Stop it!" Their eyes brightened at the new voice, but she was not expecting its source at all. It was Matthew, as clean and well put as always in those seemingly unlimited supply of long-sleeved, high-neck polos of his. "Let them go." Brungo paused and looked at him, wondering if he was serious. Matthew looked back at him and sent him a warning stare. "I will kick you out if you do any more." Brungo's eyebrows rose in disbelief, and he gritted his teeth, glaring. "You. Are you listening or not?" Brong thought for a while and frowned. He sneered before sending Matthew a glare, not forgetting to give them one last kick before leaving the hut. The two lads groaned, but not without laboriously turning their heads to look at the newcomer, eyes filled with befuddlement. Matthew paused to look at them, not speaking for a while. "I want them out safely in a minute," he said before leaving again. The door shut and the air was still. It was as if he wasn't there. Except for Auntie's sobs, the air of silence remained in the room. The trio looked at each other. Matthew, he saved them, after sending goons after them. Crow naturally hated the man who was part of his beautiful aunt's brutal murder. Did he have to set up such a show to get their approval? What the hell is he up to? Bang! Huge fists filled with sharp metallic rings connected to Matthew's stomach, quickly making him lose his footing. His dark ash blonde hair was uncharacteristically all over his face, sticking as he sweated in pain. He didn't speak and just gripped his stomach, coughing in pain, but he didn't show any hint of fear, despair, or hate, as always. Tusk, the large man, sneered, spitting on him. "Did you think you'd escape easily from a punch?" he said, kicking him several times until he couldn't move anymore. The larger man's eyes traced over him, seeming to revel in his pitiful state. "You think just because you're the lord here you can do whatever you want, right?" Lying down and eating dirt, Matthew forced himself to utter out words, "Brother-in-law." "So you still remember I'm your brother-in-law?" the man roared as he kicked again, still with more strength. "Do you want your sister's medicine to be thrown into the mouths of monsters?" This finally made his impassive look change, and he paled further. "No, The man seemed happy to finally see fear in his eyes, but it naturally did not calm his aggressiveness, and the man habitually kicked a bit more. "Then why did you stop my men, huh?" he yelled, sending him yet another kick, this time on his leg. Matthew gasped and tried to lift himself up to explain. I thought F for you, cough, it W was for you to get more." Interested, the man finally stopped kicking. "Continue." It took a moment for Matthew to gather himself, but he spoke even before he could. He knew how impatient this man was, after all. For producers, it's better to gain access by cooperation. Matthew used this moment of respite to sit up and wipe the blood from his mouth. Their territory could produce the items they sell. Our village does not have this capability. Then make it so. It's not that easy, cough, the technical talents are in their territory. Do you think they'd allow us to steal these talents when we beat them up off the bat? The man paused, rubbing his bushy beard in thought. Then what do you plan to do? Matthew's hand gripped the soil beside him, eyes flashing with bitterness. Gain their trust and gain access to their talents. He paused and Higson looked at him in interest. "And continue." Matthew pursed his lips, his eyes darkening. "I will use my assets to get them back to the territory." The man stared at him and grabbed his face. He looked at Matthew's handsome face, the only part of him without bruises. He cackled, very amused. Heh, as expected for the brother of a slut. Matthew wanted to bow his head to hide the uncharacteristic hideous expression on his face. Sadly, the man held his face firmly, and he couldn't move away at all. It was unknown whether Higson knew what he was thinking, but he spat out again, as if expressing his disgust. "Be thankful you have a useful face," he said as he gripped Matthew's white face and sneered. "Otherwise I'd love to see it as colored as every other part of you." That night, Matthew sat on the cold wooden floor of his bedroom, groaning in pain. Using the dwindling first aid kit in his space, he dabbed some medicine on his bruises. It was at this time the door opened to reveal an emaciated but beautiful woman who had very similar features to him. She gasped as she kneeled beside him, looking at his body with no good skin left. "Oh, Matthew." As she handled his wound, tears continuously fell from her eyes turning darker. "I'm sorry if I weren't here, you." If she was gone. Matthew was very familiar with this somber look. "Don't say that," he roared, and the woman shut her mouth, just helping him deal with his wound without saying anything. Matthew watched her with a frown, heart constricting in fear of what she could do. The most recent time she tried to kill herself was not even that long ago. It was when she threw herself at a monster during the beast tide, intent on getting mauled. It was lucky that he was nearby, or else he'd have lost his only relative. He looked at this woman who was both his sister and mother. She was only 5 years older than him, but it felt like she took on the burden of generations. She was so good, he could still remember when they were children and had parents. She always brought home so many awards. Look at her now. She's like this because of me, he couldn't help but muse, every time he saw her pitiful state. When their parents died, she had to drop out of college to support him. There were teachers who tried to convince her, but she refused every time. Even if she got scholarships, how could the meager allowance support them both? Then she found out she had trialphas, a disease requiring expensive maintenance for daily life, and then all hope of returning to school was lost. His upbringing and her disease rendered her unable to have any other choice but to put away her talents. Inadvertently, she was pulled into a dirty industry because of her beauty, to her now husband's most lucrative business. He tried to pull her out of it, but what could a teenager do? So he chose a path of power, politics, and he was talented at it. He was even hailed as the most promising young politician of the decade. Unfortunately, before he could garner any power, she had already gotten pregnant and tied the knot with the bastard, and now he held her life in one hand. There was a time that they had managed to escape from him, though, the disaster known as the apocalypse. To others it was hell, but to the two siblings it was an unexpected hope. It was finally their chance for a decent life. To others, the apocalypse brought only horror, pain, and losses. To the two of them, it meant freedom. It started when he found out his sister suffered a miscarriage after receiving a beating from Higson. Matthew only saw red the moment he heard the news from someone he bought from inside. She was still in their home. He didn't even bother taking her to the hospital. He went mad and disregarded the politician image he had been trying to maintain, driving like a speed racer to confront the man. However, despite his rage, he was not entirely irrational. Before heading to the imminent battle, he sent all the results of his investigations to his friends, telling them to call the police should he not contact them within 24 hours. He had been waiting for the perfect time to release the documents, but he needed them divorced first before he could do so. Otherwise, his sister could be dragged in the legality of everything as his wife. He had been planning on showing all those evidence to his sister later that week. As he drove, he kept thinking, had he moved just a few days earlier, had he been more decisive? Anyway, today, he was determined to get them divorced that day, no matter what. "Matthew, please wait." A familiar voice sounded, and he turned in a direction, and he saw his pale sister hurriedly getting out of a cab. His sister knew him too well, it seemed. "Sister," he yelled, catching her when she lost her footing due to weakness. "Don't do it. Nothing can stop this, sister." Melissa paused and looked at him. "I'm coming with you." "No," Matthew growled, yelling at his sister for the first time in his life. Melissa did not falter, gripping his arm, with her eyes particularly filled with fight, something he had not seen in many years. Seeing this, his stance softened a bit and he heaved a sigh to calm himself. "You can't do anything. You'll only make me worry when you come." "How would we divorce if I hadn't signed the papers yet? I must be there." "No, you don't." But she blocked his way with her whole being, threatening to hang herself if he didn't return in half a day. The thing was, Matthew wasn't sure if he could return in half a day. In the end, he could only succumb to her demands. "If he shoots you," she had told him at the time, her eyes filled with determined light, "then he shoots us together." The two of them looked at each other, nodding, and mightily ran to the man's base. However, on his way up the elevator, his vision darkened and he woke up and everybody else was asleep. He shook his sister, who fortunately woke up, and they dragged themselves over the figures on the ground, heading to their destination regardless. Then the bodies started flinching, getting up, and moving so stiffly that he could hear their bones cracking. The bodies darted to them without warning, trying to eat them, but he was quick to take one of the guns lying on the floor, barely managing to save their lives. Weird game-like notifications appeared, but he was in no mood to raid any of them. He didn't know what happened, but he wanted to take advantage to finally end the bastard. He went to the most guarded area in his base, but Higson wasn't there. He only saw his piles and piles of gold and jewelry instead. His eyebrows furrowed and they approached the treasure trove. "How many lives did this cost?" he asked, touching the nearest gold bar with a heavy heart. A floating notification appeared in front of him, but he was in no mood to absorb any of it. The next thing he knew, a ding sounded inside his head, followed by a glaring text. "Gained gold." And then he realized none of the gold and jewelry remained. He turned his head to his sister, who looked just as mystified. They just disappeared. She told him, but his heart pounded like no tomorrow. At the time, he had no idea what it implied. He was just terrified that the money Higson worked so hard for disappeared from his watch. The high of courage from before diffused, and he was determined to just take his sister away from it all. He escaped with his sister to reach the migration period, hiding in the nearby residential area and filling up their space with what they could. Then they arrived in this world. He built up a territory using the money he stole from him. They even named it Vismont, which meant the land of rebirth in the old language of their mother tongue. Unfortunately, it didn't last long as his gang and his guns eventually found his territory, and he had to sacrifice too much to keep everyone's lives. If the Lord's token hadn't been infused to him, there was no doubt he'd have lost it, along with his life. Back to the present, Melissa looked at his brother with a broken heart. Her brother was so good and so kind, but associating with that bastard would only denigrate his achievements, his great self crimped by Higson's control. Even if he was doing the best he could for the people, considering everything, it meant nothing because Higson and his cronies were there, making everyone suffer. If it wasn't for her disease, her brother would have dealt with those bastards as soon as they appeared. How could she bear it? Melissa couldn't help but sob. "Sister, don't worry," he said, thinking of the mysterious group of people who had already done so many miracles in such a short period of time. It wasn't that there were no doctors in his territory, on the contrary, there were plenty, but what could doctors do without medicine? But more than the resources they had, he cared more about something else. They were strong. Very strong. He held his sister's hand firmly, this time with renewed hope in his eyes. "I may have found us a way out." Vismont village, many weeks prior. Inside one of the many identical houses in the village, Matthew was happily planning for their small village's development. He was using some excess paper he managed to hoard back in Terran. He had already made a preliminary zoning plan of the village, and he felt joy whenever he thought of its imminent execution. He might have started politics for his sister, but he quickly fell in love with public service. Now he had all the power, and there was no need for the cumbersome red tapes and pandering to arrogant old men to implement his vision. Despite the monsters outside, he optimistically thought that he was really living a dream. His daydream, however, was quickly broken by a desperate knock pounded on his door. It was a young man with curly red hair. It was one of his few guards, Oliver, and he was incredibly pale and scared. Matthew put down everything and stood up, looking at him worriedly. "What's going on?" Oliver immediately turned around and asked him to follow, saying many people would die if they were late. "What?" he exclaimed, but he ran out of his own home without another word. The air was tense and a palpable unease lingered in his village. His heart felt like it was gripped tightly by something. This was a bad premonition. Did a mob attack their village again? Matthew asked himself, over and over, until he ran to where Oliver was leading him. But if it was a beast tide, why was everything so quiet? He only heard some whimpers at most. He would soon find that it was not a beast tide, however, it was worse. Well, a pause, nice place you have here." Matthew's heart dropped as he heard Higson's voice, and his eyes met the other ones. It was filled with malice, glaring at him with undisguised hostility. Around him were about 100 men, each one with a gun on hand, pointing at a different citizen who were all pale and shivering, eyes wide with fear as they looked at him filled with hope. Matthew wanted to kick these gangsters out, but everyone had guns, and they could shoot people even before he could do anything. At this time, he had not yet discovered the automatic execution of regulations. Even if he did, he might not necessarily have the money to purchase it on his own, especially not when the person was only threatening and had yet to do actual damage. Matthew very well knew what Higson's arrival meant, which made his heart heavier the more the metaphorical clock ticked by. He established this village for about a few days now, and they had been building it together. His group of less than 1,000 people had worked hard to build this, to fight the monsters that came their way. Was it all going to be for naught? This should all cost a lot, right? Higson asked, looking at him in suspicion. I wonder how you did it. And you built all these in a couple of days. How? Matthew didn't speak. Higson sneered and he turned to a direction. As if on cue, a gun touched the forehead of a random woman next to them. She sobbed and looked at Matthew imploringly. Help me, my lord, she sobbed, and she immediately shut her mouth when the gun was harshly pushed against her head. Tell me, Higson yelled, making everyone flinch. Matthew shut his eyes and clenched his fist, but he had no choice but to answer. I received a lord's token. It allowed me to build all these. How come it's just you? Where's mine? Where is it? He said and narrowed his eyes. The treasure I lost a while back. It's integrated into my body, Matthew immediately said before they attacked him for the token. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but feel relieved, and he ended up looking at his brother-in-law with chin high, for once. It's integrated in my body, he repeated. I don't know what happens if I die. Higson paused and looked at him, laughing. It happened very quickly. Higson made a slight nod and... Bang! A bullet went through the woman's head. You, Matthew growled, about to kick them out and risking a few losses, lest they make any more damage. But then several of his goons held on to more people, with their hands on the trigger, guaranteeing death for them. Matthew's ears rang, a bit panicked, but he managed to keep his wits enough to try to find a way out. But then it got worse, and all his cool dissipated into thin air. Kane, Higson yelled, and a relatively decent-looking man emerged. He was very clean, unlike the others. The newcomer sauntered to the center, and Matthew's eyes constricted at the sight of who he was holding. Sister, he yelled, but he could only freeze as she was dragged closer to Higson, who grabbed her face. He sneered when he saw the beautiful woman was still pale and sickly. Considering how you ran, I had thought her disease had magically healed. He then heard the sound of guns clinging, and the soft clicking sounds of the trigger nearly being pressed, and his heart dropped. Fortunately, the triggers weren't pressed, but their hearts remained high, as if ready to fall down. Snail! Melissa was pushed down on her knees. Matthew wanted to run to her, but a gun pointed at her head, ready to press it at a moment's notice. Matthew was prepared to bend his knees when his sister screamed. Don't do it, Melissa yelled with all her might and emotions, shivering at the memories of so many horrors triggered by the sight of her husband. Don't give in, please, or it will never end. She said so, looking valiant, but the adrenaline and emotions were too much for her body. She felt her vision blur and a wave of dizziness washed over her, falling down head first. Sister, Matthew yelled, but a gun pointed at him and his sister, and he could only watch as she tried to move, uncoordinated, and her speech slurred. His heart froze at the familiar sight, some harsh memories washing over him and making him shake in fear. His sister assured him she had brought medicine. Was it already gone? To have such symptoms, she must have ran out for days. Then Higson lifted a vial, and his eyes constricted. When I found out my treasure was gone, I made sure to take all of this I could gather. Seems like my instincts still serve me well. The other man grinned, arrogantly looking down at him. Are you kneeling or not? Are you kneeling or not? His head was ringing, knowing full well his sister would feel even worse if he did so, if he could get the medicine some other way. Bang! His eyes widened as a young lad, a teenager no more than 13 years old, had his head blown during his moment of doubt. You, he yelled, but his knees had long been weakened. With this catalyst, it completely gave way, and he flopped down to kneel on the floor. Let them go, please, he said, gritting his teeth in anger, humiliation, and worry for his sister and his people. Unexpectedly, Higson laughed. Nyahaha, why would I? He said, do you think I'm so stupid? Do you think I didn't see you were planning on doing something earlier? What, kick me out? Matthew paled, and Higson's eyes turned red at his reaction, confirming his theory. You will follow all my orders, understood, like you always did. He grinned and Matthew's fist clenched. He looked down, covering the sharp light in his eyes, but then he thought he just needed the right timing. He could get rid of them. But his hopes were quickly dashed as Higson continued speaking. We've been studying this place, and a person of mine, Kane, smart guy, found that. He paused, looking in the direction of the aforementioned man amongst his people, the one who pulled in his sister. We found that you can sign contracts and stuff, the kind that can't be taken back. Matthew's jaw clenched, his heart tightening. What do you want? Swear loyalty to me, follow my orders, he said, both of you. Only if you and your people promise not to kill anyone anymore, he said. Sure, I promise that we will not kill anymore. Otherwise, if you find out, you are free to punish the person as you like. Higson grinned as he said so, waving his sister's medicine in front of his face. He was holding it so carelessly as if he could drop it any time. The man's golden teeth glinted as he stared down at him, the metal reflecting light that blinded him in many senses of the word. How could he not hear the loopholes in his side of the deal? But what choice did he have? Matthew felt his world was darker again. Would they really see no end? 9 days of protection period. Vismont Village, present. Matthew opened his eyes as he blinked away the remaining lethargy in his body. He shifted his body to get out of the bed, but the sharp aches of his injuries attacked, and he groaned in pain. Damn it, he yelled against his pillow, not bothering to get up. Anyway, it was still dark, he ought to rest more. Maybe this pain would be better by then. Unfortunately, even getting back to sleep was difficult, because now he felt pain even while he was breathing. Realizing he really wouldn't be able to get back to sleep, he decided to do something productive, ideally to distract himself. He got up and laboriously dressed into one of his long-sleeved turtlenecks. It was a pain to wear, literally, but he had no choice unless he wanted to showcase all of his bruises. He trudged to his office, a refurbished residential unit next to the village center. Heaving a sigh, he closed his eyes to feel the silence around him. His only light was the sparse torches and the 2 moons. It took him a while to gather himself, and he sat straight up again, arms on his desk. As he sat on his crude chair, he then looked at the state of his territory. Territory stats. Name, Vismont Village is. Status, Level 2 Village. Area, 12,566,371 square meters. Residents, 907, 67 permanent, 840 temporary. Total population, 10,524. Base resources. Wood, 6,701,0000. Stone, 5,508,000. Money, 91 gold, 12,743 silver, 86,097 copper. Reputation, 30. Buildings, Village Center, LV1, Weaponry Shop, LV1, Defensive Wall, LV2, Restaurant, LV1, Residence Type 1, Well *2, LV1, Mansion. Building slots, 7. He sighed even deeper at his near-empty pockets. Don't look at the taxes and donations he managed to solicit. Not even half of it remained in his pockets. Not even the increase in the payment for residency helped, and that took a toll on everyone. He had worked very hard to convince Higsons to keep the visitor's fee as it was, and it earned him a very hard beating in response. The doctor said had he not reached level 4 when it happened, he'd have died from the beatings. On the other hand, the money he had gained went to building houses, restaurants, and wells. The rest, it went to Higson's party. What did the bastard use so much money for, one would wonder? It was to feed himself, his cronies, and his dozens of women until they vomited. At some point, Matthew just thought to himself that this was paying back the gold he borrowed back then. He had to do this small brainwashing, so he didn't die of bitterness and anger. A pity for all the functions he could have added for the territory had he retained all that money. It wasn't that he didn't want to upgrade the village hall, but he really didn't have funds. He didn't know what happened after the upgrade, but the high cost probably meant it had good additional functions. What was worse was that he also wasted a building slot to buy the mansion, located in a prohibited area in the territory. The basic armory was forgone because of it. This special residential estate took about a quarter of the whole territory, and it was all given to Higson as his private estate, where he could do whatever he wanted without regard for him, any law, or any moral rules whatsoever. It was a quarter of the territory, but over half of the crimes committed in Vismont happened here. In less than a month, a lot of people disappeared within these forests. They did not even bother burying them, and he had seen plenty of bodies just lying around when he went there. It was a disgusting place that ought to be burned to the ground. However, he never lied to himself and gave himself an excuse. Whatever happened there, he was complicit as the lord of this place. But no matter how disgusted he was, he couldn't do anything. It was either justice for others or his sister's life. Not to mention he swore to serve, or he and his sister would die. Not to mention, he had a feeling the territory would fall if he died, in which case that was thousands more lives at stake. There was no choice at all. Not until those people arrived. Higson's chaos had to end, lest he lose his sanity and the people lose their homes. And now, with these new visitors, he finally got a chance. He didn't know if he'd be entering a deal with the devil with them, but it would definitely be a lesser evil than Higson. At least, that was what he was praying for. Anyway, this alterer, whether good or bad, was a catalyst for change, and he was determined to make use of it. Matthew recalled the rants of the guards yesterday. At first, he had difficulty in believing them, thinking they were exaggerating to make him move. This couldn't be blamed on him. After all, they had claimed that 2 level 3 guards couldn't even make the enemy guard, who was now known to be an aborigine, lift a finger. But as he watched the Alterans the past day, he realized that these people were much more powerful than he imagined. Even his fellow Terrans were stronger than they were on average. As a level 4 individual, he could tell the weakest among them were level 3. This was very amazing. There were over 10,000 people in his territory, not even 100 were at level 3. This alone sent signals that this alterer was not a simple territory, and he could feel that it was much, much more powerful than his own. He also saw the temperament of his guests. They were energetic, lively, and filled with hope. All of them were like that, even his former citizens who had only been gone for a couple of days. And most importantly, they could also produce so many items that he had deemed impossible to see in the short term. Amazingly, they could even produce to the point of having a surplus. What if they had the medicine they needed as well? After all, trialphas wasn't an uncommon disease. As he mused deeply about his next point of action, an urgent knock sounded, pulling him out of his trance. "My lord, come in." The door opened to reveal a kind-looking old man with half-squinted eyes. Mitchell's tense stance softened at the sight of the other person, who immediately stood in front of his table with a little urgency. If the twins were here, they'd realize this man was the old clothes repairer they encountered just the day prior. "Old Yao, what is it, so early?" This was Old Yao, one of his confidants. In his free time, he fixed other people's clothes for a fee. This time, though, his usual calm face betrayed a bit of worry. Matthew's eyebrows rose. His heart dropped automatically because emergencies in this place usually made him suffer a lot. "What's the matter?" he asked, a bit afraid of the answer. Hopefully, it was nothing life or death. "Those people are already preparing to leave," the old man said, making Matthew abruptly stand up. What? But he didn't ask anymore. He simply walked out and went straight to the house the group rented. Indeed, some of the Alterans were already waiting outside for the rest of the group, very ready to leave. Matthew frowned, looked at the dark sky, and saw that it wasn't even dawn yet. He stood still for a while before asking the nearest person for the leader. For this team, there seemed to be 2, the Aborigine and the woman. Among the leaders, it was the woman who soon came out to meet him. She didn't look particularly surprised to see him, and there was no sign of dislike, which was a good thing for him. "How can we help this lord?" she asked. "You are in such a rush to leave." "Well, the territory sent another mission. We would like to try doing it for points." "What?" "We were asked to look for resource points." "Just lately?" "Yes, we just received the notification last night." Matthew flinched. That could be done. Why was he so behind the news? Anyway, this was not the topic he came here to discuss. Heaving a deep breath, he looked at the woman, the atmosphere quickly turning solemn. "I would like to speak to the decision-maker in private." Sylvia looked at him for a moment before nodding, getting him inside their temporary abode. The moment they entered the house, though, he was met with hostile stares. At this time, a few people stepped in and looked at him guardedly. Since they were already leaving, he reckoned they didn't want to bother being polite with him, someone they disliked. "What do you want, Lord?" the taller boy asked, crossing his arms. He knew these kids and had an idea why they were biased against him, understandably so. Especially the boy with a somber disposition, Crow Higgins. His aunt had been a victim of Higson's party, one of the more direct ones. Crow's aunt was one of the women Higson took fancy to, but refused. The man then got one of his gangsters to defile her and kill her. This gangster, Kane, was very unassuming, and he didn't think he was so vile with his neat appearance. It was only after Higgins' aunt passed that he also found out this gangster killed even more. Mitchell truly wanted to massacre him and give him a brutal death penalty like in the medieval ages. But he had to lower his punishment because Higson was the man's friend. He let that guy go out of the territory as punishment at the order of Higson. To others, this could be considered a punishment indeed, but Matthew always felt that that man was a cockroach and would still be alive to this date. In any case, for the victim's family, he had no excuse. He didn't even explain himself because none of it would be enough. Regardless of all the complications, however, he knew he didn't have much time. He bowed his head, tone sincere. "Let me talk to you," he said, "please." This humble gesture surprised everyone, and after looking at each other, this alerted everyone of the seriousness. Most of the people outside the leadership circle, though curious, went out on their own. The ones that remained in the room other than Sylvia and Rowan were the other four, claiming they knew him the best and they ought to be there. There was no furniture, so they stood inside the room, waiting for the Lord to speak up. "As the Lord of this territory, I would like to request a deal." "Don't trust him, Rowan. He definitely isn't as clean as he looks," Dog whispered, trying to be tactful by not yelling. But Matthew was a level 4 individual. How could he not hear it? Rowan did not speak for a while, but only stared at Matthew, who had let go of his prideful image and was in a humble stance the whole time. Rowan's red eyes stared him down, and Matthew felt a little hairy. After a beat, Rowan finally spoke. It would depend on the deal. Matthew paused as he looked down, his hand gripping his leg. When he raised his head, a renewed light could be seen. "I am willing to do anything," he said with certainty, "as long as you clear the territory of those scum." If Higson had plenty of loopholes in their deal, they could kill as long as he didn't see it directly, and could even decide on the punishment because of their leverage. He, too, placed one for himself. He simply couldn't betray him or his party directly. If he didn't give explicit assistance to whoever would deal with Higson, then he was safe. Higson either didn't notice or didn't care because he was too confident in himself, his men and his guns. Anyway, because Vismont didn't prohibit fighting, dealing with Higson's group of men was surprisingly simple. What's more, there was someone who triumphed over everyone in level. It could be said that Higson's order to allow for violence, and with so many loopholes, had backfired on him horrendously. Of course, per the Lord Althea's order never to coddle her citizens, except for dealing with the few people with guns, Rowan didn't make a move. There was also the fact that he didn't want to accidentally start a formal war. It was uncertain to what degree he could fight, but he feared a territory war would be triggered prematurely. From what he heard, triggering a war without warning caused some consequences to the attacking territory. After all, there was conventionally a 28-hour warning before an attack. What would be its use if people could attack as they wanted? At this point, Rowan was thinking too much. Even if they did exceed the force requirement to qualify as wagging war, which they didn't, the lord of the defending territory, who will be alerted the moment it was triggered, must formalize it first. Of course, if that was indeed to happen and Matthew decided not to trigger a war, then his life could be forfeited due to his deal with Higson. But all of these were what-ifs. Things happened to go in the Alteran's and Matthew's favor, primarily due to Higson's arrogance. In any case, to be safe, while Rowan didn't attack, he did defend, and his defense was explosive. For instance, at the moment, Rowan was surrounded by a snake made of fire, which attacked people as he ordered, burning near them, destroying their guns, distracting them enough so that the Alterans could deal with them easily. At this, Matthew couldn't help but be in awe of Rowan, his dull eyes beginning to shine a bit of light. Fire. He could control fire. As the Aborigine stared at the fire whip in marvel, Matthew seemed to have been brought back to his missing childhood. None of this showed in his face, however, and he continued to watch the fight from afar, looking quite professional. Soon, he came to understand that the rest of the guards, and even some of their normal citizens, could fight really well. Especially those twins who were particularly fierce. It was so safe that Rowan still had the time to send some critiques, especially to the normal citizens. "Leo, don't put too much force on your attacks. Take advantage of the others' momentum instead." Very good, Cassie, you just need to commit more to your attacks. What are you doing, dog? Do you want to destroy your teeth? The group also all had a plethora of weapons and techniques, and medicine. Matthew's eyes shone at the sight of medicine that stopped the bleeding so quickly. This made his eyes brighten more than the magic. Sure enough, there was medicine in their territory. How are you guys so powerful? He asked out loud, and Sylvia, who happened to be standing next to him, was the one to answer. The woman's eyes never left the fight, and she smiled at this question. She too had a crossbow in her hand, shooting away in leisure. She smiled at him, eyes filled with pride. Our territory is so good, all of us simply wanted to do our part in protecting it. They beat their way through the huge estate, dealing with the remaining gangsters. Although they were only a few dozen people, the lowest of them was level 3, the other party had no chance. Not to mention that backup Rowan was right behind them, to protect them from major injuries, mostly by shooting accurate fireballs when he needed to. Eventually, they reached a large castle-like house in the middle of the forest. There were still about a dozen men with their bows and arrows, and a few remaining guns. They were behind a level 2 wall, and there were high risks of casualties if they attacked recklessly. Rowan's power wasn't enough to deal with the level 2 fence straightforwardly either. After all, he wasn't a beast with iron skin. Those so-called guns could still damage a human of his level. Even if it wouldn't be much, successive shots would definitely injure him. If he was injured, others from his side would probably be as well. Fortunately, the Lord gave them a secret weapon to deal with similar situations. He took a palm-sized ball from his space, lit it up with his ability, and threw it behind the walls. Foosh! Nothing happened for a moment, and Rowan thought he must have done something wrong. He frowned, feeling guilty of wasting the Lord's efforts. However, before he could think of an apology, a dense fluff of violet smoke exploded from this tiny ball, and soon the people behind fell down one by one. He blinked in surprise. He didn't know what it did. The Lord only told him when and how to use it, but Rowan was truly amazed. How did that much force fit inside such a tiny ball the size of his finger? Gas bomb! Someone yelled, and they turned to Rowan with burning eyes. It's Ms. Althea's doing. He looked at the sparkling eyes of the men. There's only one. Their shoulders slumped visibly, but they quickly recovered when they thought of the bomb eventually becoming available to them. It wasn't like the destructive bomb anyway. It was just a very potent gas bomb, hence there was a very high chance of it becoming commercially available in the future. In any case, they effortlessly entered the gate after letting the wind pass. Of course, they did not put down their guards, unsure of what they would see inside. They walked through the gate and walked along the dense forests, weapons raised high in case of an attack and traps. They dared not relax even if they got this far fairly easily and without injuries. After all, they were in the enemy territory now. Crack! Ah! Dog yelled when he felt imbalanced. Everyone raised their weapons while Crow was ready to rescue him, thinking it was a trap. It wasn't. A bone, Dog yelled, throwing a human bone that he accidentally took on hand. Because it hadn't been long since they transferred, these bones still had a lot of skin, making it even more disgusting. The women screamed and the men yelled, realizing there was more than one. Shit! What the heck? A lot of people puked, and some couldn't even bear to look. There were even carcasses, some were only a few days old. And worse. Jimmy, it was Sonny who yelled, and Crow and Dog immediately ran. It was Jimmy, the one who chatted with her deeply when she was selling stuff. He bought a lot of things and expressed interest in seeing the territory. They were just talking yesterday. The atmosphere was extremely heavy. Matthew's head was lowered in shame, fists clenched, avoiding the several glances that came his way. No one spoke again after that, and they just continued forward. The difference was that before, it was just an attack based on interests. Now, it was personal. They soon saw a structure in the middle of the forest. It was a small castle hidden in the woods. It was one of the premier buildings available, but everyone just found it vile. This must end, now. They frowned and entered the gate, with Rowan leading the way. At his level, although he could get injured, these people's guns would not kill him. And because the estate was so huge, and there were no shots fired in the fence, the people were completely unaware of their arrival. making the trip relatively easier than anticipated, at least at first. However, as they entered further, a disgusting stench attacked their nostrils. It smelled dirty and pungent. It made their eyes twitch. Suddenly, Rowan pulled back the person next to him. "Watch out," he yelled, throwing a fireball at a direction, followed by a tokeling scream. The man screamed as he was burned alive. When the killing prohibition was implemented, it was only applied to areas outside the estate, as ordered by Higson in exchange for a week's worth of medicine. It was the reason why there were so many corpses. It was just that he never would have imagined that there would be so much. He knew Higson was shady, but this was not human. It was just something beyond his imagination. Whether or not he knew, his citizens outside did not know about this exemption. How many of his citizens hoped that the people inside were still alive, somehow? His heart clenched at the inevitable despair many of them would feel when they found so many people still died. He felt ashamed, too ashamed. The scream attracted a few people on the ground floor, easily dealt with by their team. As they finished off the trash, the redhead put out the fire on the burning corpse in case it spread, and they continued on. Walking past the dead bodies, the group moved forward and went to the upper floors. Now experienced, they handled the guards on the floor well and silently, and they soon heard different types of noises as they went deeper into the mansion. They could hear laughter and screams and odd noises around the house. It was so loud it probably masked the screams from earlier. Walking forward, they did not immediately go to where the activity seemed to be. They decided to clear out the floor to minimize the enemies coming from behind. With Rowan in front, they opened a room nearby, only to see a bunch of naked women filled with scars and bruises, eyes staring blankly in random directions. They could obviously see, but there was no change in their expressions at all. Even if they heard them, they did not turn their heads, no doubt thinking of them as anybody else who had been here. These women probably just thought they were the same type of people as those who came before them, and they just stayed there, like lifeless dolls. Anger flowed into each of their veins at the sight. Scum, total scum. Crow was silent, looking at the bruises, and realized it was familiar with what was found with his aunt. Angry, the team went from room to room, taking down the lewd activities going on. They took down aggressive individuals and tied down the rest for later handling. They soon found Higson having his way with two women. One was unbound, but the other was tied all around. They were so engrossed in their activity that they didn't notice the commotion outside. Or perhaps he did, and if that was the case, then it was actually more disgusting because it meant that he heard the same noise often, but in totally different contexts. The images of the women filled with bruises flashed by their heads, and they recalled the corpses outside, and their sights turned even redder. Matthew went blind with rage, and he quickly ran and attacked Higson. He vented all his anger, not only for what he had witnessed, but for the years of suffering and humiliation he and his sister went through because of him. Caught off guard, Higson endured several punches and kicks before he could counter. They had the same level, but Higson had more experience in this, and it didn't take long for him to make a comeback. Unfortunately for him, Matthews was not alone, and other people quickly held Higson. They were not gentle, and Higson screamed like a pig. Crow, having an idea of what happened, kicked him with all his strength. Matthew walked over and pulled back his oily hair. "Give me the medicine and you will keep your life." Higson gave a bloody grin. "You want to save your sister? Dream." Matthew darkened, and he kicked Higson like he used to kick him. On the other hand, as they watched, Crow and the others looked complicated. They seemed to have misjudged a poor person. However, a lot of the wrongs in the territory had his approval. He was not innocent in all of these. The corpses outside and the women here. Did the citizens know what was going on? Would they still respect him as much as they used to? Matthew continued to beat Higson up, only to receive his annoying grin. It took dozens more of attacks until the man took out a small box of vials. "This is all that's left," he said, and Matthew didn't even have the time to worry about what happened when it was gone. At least they could delay the problem. He heaved out a sigh, stopping his attacks, and stretched his hands to get the item. But Higson threw it away. "No," he yelled, immediately running to catch it. Taking advantage of the distraction, Higson took out his remaining gun from the space and pointed at Matthew, whose entire attention was to catch the medicine. The moment it landed and broke was when Matthew saw the nozzle pointed at him. Bang! Matthew watched as Higson's body turned to flames, screaming at the top of his lungs as he was burned alive. Matthew watched every second of it. "Thank you for saving my life," he told Rowan when the fire died down, but his eyes had shifted to the broken glass and liquid that was absorbed by the floor, not knowing what he was thinking. Melissa, who sneaked into the battlefield, arrived shortly after. She saw Higson being burned alive and the seeping medicine in front of her brother. Melissa had a rough image of what happened and frowned, not because of the lost medicine, but because of the despair her little brother must have been feeling. She slowly walked to her brother and wrapped her skeleton-thin arms around him. "My baby brother, you've done your best." Her tone was extremely gentle and comforting, and it broke his heart even more. "There's no need to struggle anymore," she told him, voice so soothing like it always was, and Matthew couldn't help but break into sobs. "You already worked hard enough," she told him. "Thank you for everything." "Thank you for everything." The soft voice of his sister sounded in his ears, pulling him out of his daze. His hands clenched as she wrapped her bony arms around him. Matthew was not reconciled. Why was the world so unfair to them? His sister was the only family he had left. The world was so cruel to them. It seemed like it wanted to take his only family left, even after everything. She was his sister, his mother, and his anchor. If he didn't have her, would he be able to deal with anything that came after? But if he did follow her to the grave, what about the citizens? If he didn't, what about him? Melissa's eyes lined with tears at the manic look in her brother's eyes, wrapping her thin arms around him even tighter. No, you're going to be fine." "You're so young," she sobbed. "I've held you back long enough." The calm lord that they knew broke down crying, and his sister couldn't help but do the same. They watched the sad scene of the siblings' despair with complicated eyes. It could be seen that the lives of these two were quite tragic. They really couldn't tell Matthew's life experience was so colorful. They thought he was born with a silver spoon. His current disposition was very unlike the image he had as a magnificent lord. It was the soft-hearted dog who couldn't watch it anymore. He walked closer to the siblings and cleared his throat. It's not entirely hopeless." The siblings paused and turned to look at him with very similar looks of confusion, eyes still a little red from sadness. Dog stared for a bit before he could utter a word. "It's not hopeless because your disease isn't unfixable with the current situation. There were a number of people in our territory that had trialphas." "What?" Melissa voiced out, while Matthew held on to Dog's shoulders directly. "And then, do they have a lot of medicine?" Dog shook his head, and the siblings visibly paled. Dog flinched, not expecting a short pause would bring so much emotional damage. He was clearly not yet finished speaking. "Okay. They don't have a lot of medicine because they don't need them anymore." The two didn't speak and just stared at him, eagerly waiting for him to continue. Dog felt a little shy and cleared his throat again. "The Trialpha's patients in our territory only had to watch their food intake when they reached level 2. Basically, Miss just had to level up to heal. They could see the woman was only level 1 after so long, the type that barely even managed to get to the level. This could mean that after all this time, she was very protected or trapped. One of our guards even had stage 1 cancer." Dog paused, pointing his chin to one of the men kicking the unruly tied-up gangsters to make them behave. His lips twitched. Dog coughed before turning his head to the siblings. "As you can see, he's quite healthy." Sonny stood beside him and nodded. "Besides, even if there's something lacking, maybe Ms. Althea can help." Dog's eyes widened at the realization. "Yes, right, Ms. Althea's medicines are very good, especially those that she makes herself. That's just miracle medicine, man." The two watched as the conversation turned to a new individual, with such a gushing tone too. Matthew looked at the two and spoke after their spiel. "Ms. Althea, the one that makes the medicine you guys took before." "Well, her company's. It would be such a waste to use Ms. Althea's medicine for such small wounds." His eyebrows rose from what he saw. The wounds were not small wounds. "Yes, Ms. Althea's amazing." Dog and the guards showed expressions of admiration that Matthew was even more curious. In any case, Matthew walked back to his sister and took time to absorb this information. Slowly, the new information dawned on them, finally understanding the new hope that was being presented. The siblings held each other's hand, with long-lost genuine smiles slowly returning to their faces. The fall of the gangsters had echoed across the territory. While there were plenty of worries in their defense now that most of the strong people had gone, it was mostly hopeful. So what if they're strong, they had only made us suffer? Yes, sometimes, it is so much more painful to suffer under your own kind. The Alterans would be very surprised to know that very few citizens had any rebellious thoughts against their lord, despite knowing what was going on behind the scenes. Of course, this was granted they didn't know exactly what went on behind the scenes, i.e. believing the no-killing prohibition was applicable to the entire territory. It was inevitable that a lot of hearts would shift, disappointed, and even angry. For now, they were fairly forgiving. A lot of them were with the Lord when the territory was just established. If his sister died, he would too. Then what would happen to the rest of the territory? Similar situations echoed in the territory, with people just being inspired to become stronger. They had seen the Alterans, even normal citizens could fight. The gleeful atmosphere was exactly the opposite inside the formerly forbidden area. Unlike those who were celebrating, a lot of people directly entered the forbidden area, trying to find their loved ones. The citizens who went in to find relatives watched blankly as rows and rows of corpses were lined up. It was for identification. There were also plenty of girls sitting aside, blank expressions on their faces akin to the zombies they thought they left in Terran. They were finding it hard to absorb the sight, and they stutteringly looked at the Lord standing blankly. The man turned to them, red eyes, with his sister right next to him. The two of them looked wan and dark, tears flowing down their faces. "These are the people we lost to Higson," he said. "I have failed you." The citizens couldn't truly absorb his words until their feet took them to the corpses. One by one, balls of despair and sadness exploded. Some lost their family, and some their friend, but there was no one who had a dry eye in the area. The siblings felt their hearts clench at the sight, and they looked at each other. Holding a hand, they stood closer to the corpses, the victims, and their families and friends. The knees bent, landing on the stony soil below with a flop, and they kowtowed. If they could bury themselves under the soil to express their apologies, they would have. Matthew, sobbing, bellowed strongly as he prayed. "As a lord, I feel ashamed for not being able to protect my citizens. The weight of this transgression is mine to bear," he said, shaking his head when his sister wanted to intervene. "I will not make excuses. I will not ask for leniency, as I know very well that I deserve a fate worse than death. However, I hope that I can be given the chance to fix, even a little, of my wrongs by improving the lives of thousands more than who we lost. May their deaths be a reminder of what we cannot become, weak and cowardly. May we be strong enough to protect ourselves." His dull eyes soon gained a bit of light. "I, Matthew White, swear never to make the same mistake again, and I will do my part to prepare each and every one of you, my citizens, for a better life." His forehead met the ground, showing maximum humility. "Please give me this chance." Similarly, in another area with a stagnant atmosphere, a certain set of twins stood in front of a woman. Luke and Leo met the woman as they were waiting at the gates, preparing to leave. She had been watching them the whole time, though it took her a while to approach them. The two followed her to some distance away from the crowd. Arms crossed, they looked at her, waiting for her to speak. "I know whatever comes out of my mouth won't make you feel any better," she said, "but now that you're leaving, I hope you don't keep the hate in your hearts. And I am in no illusion that you will forgive me. My only wish is that you two do not live in hate. My death would not do that. You are good kids, you know what is right or wrong." She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "What I can do is assure you that I won't be getting any decent sleep from now on. As long as I live, I will suffer the consequences of my actions." She told them, "This is my guarantee." Luke and Leo sighed and looked at each other, simply walking away. As they walked, their shoulders straightened, expressions loosening. Because she was right, they didn't need to suffer for her. Hope could change a lot of things, even when nothing had yet to happen. In Vismont, there had been an obvious increase in chatter and activity, gossiping at the new shift in power, smiles filled with longing. Anyway, the group rested for a few more hours in the unit, before the Lord came to visit them again. He arrived with an old man this time. and he was still wearing his turtleneck, covering his bruises, but his disposition was a lot lighter than before. "Thank you," he said. "I don't know how to thank you more." At his smile, the trio who knew him best among their team couldn't help but take a second look at him. It was very unlike the Lord they'd seen. He seemed to become more human now. Rowan nodded with that deadpan face of his. "Just do your side of the deal." Matthew blinked and smiled. "Ah, yes, of course." The reason why every member of the team bothered to dip their toes into this mess was because of his side of the deal. Otherwise, who would bother? Sylvia and Rowan naturally got themselves quite a good deal. The deal was for Matthew to willingly let go of at least 5 talents for each person who participated in the purge, as long as the citizens agreed, of course. Matthew also promised to give incentives, which was also a low-key way of earning another territory's money, but Matthew didn't mind. He owed too much to these people, and he owed too much to his citizens. Even when he was the Lord, he knew which territory could give them a better life. How dare he take away this chance from them? Soon, an announcement echoed across Vismont Village. Mission: solidify the cooperation between 2 territories. Content: become a resident of an allied territory, Althea Village, LV2. Requirements and rewards. No minimum requirement, settlement fee of 5 silver will be given. Bonus of +5 silver for people with occupations. For a while the people were confused. Althea, one asked, and it was a lively young man who answered him. "It's the one with all the products. Remember, they said their territory produces those things." "Great, I was planning to check it out before now I have more incentive." In another area, a small group of people had bright eyes. "Oh yes, my friends and I have been planning on starting a caravan. I hear the first batch is leaving today. We should go with them, it's safer." Okuri looked at her boyfriend. "What do you think?" The silent man nodded with a smile. He pointed at her and then at him, and then placed his hands together. She smiled, understanding what he meant, together. Basically, across the territory, there would be similar conversations about migrating to another village. Some were happy and some were sad. "I understand the Lord's dilemmas, but I can't stay here anymore," one said. He had just finished burying a cousin. "Me too, my sister suffered too much, maybe going to a different territory," another uttered, holding his sister's hand. His lively sister, so beautiful and gregarious, now refusing to speak. Then there were also angrier ones. "I honestly can't look at the Lord without wanting to spit at him now." "Yeah." And there were more than a few echoes of agreement. Although they rationally understood the Lord's predicament, it didn't mean their hearts were willing to forgive. It could be said that it would take a long time for Matthew to be absolved by these people, and he understood it. He couldn't have asked for more, in fact. He wished them the best in Althea. Of course, while many were already planning on their move, there were many others who were just watching the show. After all, most of the people who had already invested their wealth in Vismont would be unwilling to move. However, they were very willing to take a look and explore. One of them was Old Yao. In his old age, he was rarely excited about a trip, but here he was. In any case, whether it was the old man or others, they were more than willing to see and do some shopping. No matter what, the Ultran products were definitely the real deal. A few hours after the announcement, the various members of the Althea team looked at the crowd of hundreds of people in glee. It was a noisy crowd, all with mixed emotions and expressions, but they all had something in common. They were all coming to Althea. There were so many. Of course, a lot of these people had the mentality of just going to look, but they were confident in their territory. A lot of them would definitely stay. Calculating the contribution points, the Ultrans couldn't help but want to dance. They could finally be permanent residents. What's more, the businesses of their teams would thrive, making their pockets even heavier. Allied territories are awesome. Chapter 244, Convergence. Vismont. In a good mood, the Ultran party exited Vismont and headed back home with great fanfare. Someone even waved back to the watching crowd. "We shall return. Prepare your funds well, Tilda," he said, already calculating how much to invest on the next trip. Sylvia and the others laughed. "What an idiot," a man said, but he was grinning widely as he said so. He too was already making plans for the next caravan. Other than the Alterans, hundreds of people followed Rowan and his team outside. While many were joining for the exchange program, a good part of the crowd were visitors who simply aimed to see the source of goods, hoping to create some money in reselling. Of course, there were also some who simply wanted to go and see this new territory because of curiosity and some other purpose. Matthew and Melissa were included in this group, with Matthew hoping to learn more about the management and Melissa to see the sources of medicine. Although it was established that she didn't need medicine, she still wanted to see what was available to them. Matthew looked back to his level 2 walls now that he was on the other side, feeling melancholic. This was the first time he would leave the territory for so long, and despite all the chaos, he had really grown to love it. Of course, before going out, he left the territory to capable hands. Although a lot of the guards were under Higson, Matthew had made sure some of them were on his side. These guards had been low-key during Higson's reign, and now they could finally do their jobs. He could still believe them and leave the territory for a day or two with ease. "Are you sure you want to come?" Matthew asked his sister for the nth time that hour, worried. After all, he had already asked his trusted guards to help his sister level up in some spots near the territory walls. His sister knew of this arrangement. However, his sister looked at him with a determined expression on her face. "Getting stronger is literally my only way to survive, little brother. Stop coddling me." Later. Anyway, seeing that there was no changing his sister's mind, he just vowed to be by her side and help her level up as soon as they could. They moved forward with a large group comprising of hundreds of people, which naturally attracted hordes of mobs. The groups came in scores at the least, and hundreds at most, and during the latter many people from Vismont couldn't help but notice they weren't being protected. A man's eyes widened as a large set of teeth was about to maul him, barely dealt with by a group from Vismont. A number of them sustained a bit of injury in the process. They frowned, looking at the Alteran guards dealing with monsters far away from them. "Hey, I was almost bitten." The guards turned to look at him but didn't leave their posts, as ordered. "You," the Vismont visitors yelled, indignant at this service. Obviously they were guests, right? No, they were very wrong. Soon after their exclamation, the tall redhead aborigine faced them, and they all shut their mouths. "Don't expect us to go out of our way to protect you," Rowan told several people from Vismont, still shaking under his stare. "Your own life still depends on you." "You," a person said, turning to their lord for justice, only to see him fighting alongside the Alterans. They were a little annoyed at first, especially with the scandal and all, but then they saw their lord skillfully kill a monster, and then guide his sister to kill another one he had weakened. They couldn't find enough shamelessness to ask him for help. Then they couldn't help but notice that every Alteran was fighting valiantly, no matter who it was. They even had bright, excited expressions on their faces. It was in stark contrast to theirs, which was filled only with fear and apprehension. Was that why everyone was so strong? The man pursed his lips and took out his weapon, finally joining the fight. Fortunately, the few people from Althea, guards or not, were strong enough to deal with low-level mobs, not to mention so many of them from Vismont. Along the way, Matthew continued to help Melissa in her fights, aiming to get her to level 2 before reaching Althea. After several hours of travel, they started seeing more and more people. They realized that these people were settled down and making camp. The Vismont people were very surprised to see people out of nowhere. After all, they knew they still had a couple more hours to go before reaching Althea. The others saw their arrival and blinked, some nodding a bit and some smiling. They were all quite friendly, and very unlike forest encounters before, which were characterized by yelling for help and despairing sobs. As they walked, they saw the stone paths and the sheds, and the Vismont group quickly realized that this was obviously a temporary camp. "You're here," a voice sounded from beside him, and they saw Dog and the others walk forward to greet some of the people from the other party. "How many did you get?" 103, the other person said proudly, plus about 100 visitors. "We got 254, Dog said, and that's just the residents. We have more visitors." The other gasped in shock. "Wow, how'd you do it?" The Alterans that went to Vismont grinned, grabbed their friend's shoulder, and told him of their adventures in his territory. At this point, if Matthew still didn't know what was going on, then he's stupid. He was mostly amazed, though. The few of their territories were so busy with their own jurisdiction, but another one was extending hands everywhere. Just how many resources did this place have? The two groups eventually merged together, and the mumblings and chatters intensified, forming an area akin to a marketplace. The guards soon formed a loose perimeter outside to deal with the mobs as they came. Fortunately, they weren't too big mobs and could be handled with relative ease. In any case, the crowds merged happily, resting in their own pace, chattering. However, several minutes in, new types of yells started to pop up in different areas. "Husband," a voice sounded from Vismont's side. The man from Bright froze at the voice, and tears lined up his eyes as he turned. Surprisingly, there were several people who knew each other, and most of them were not from Altera. "Wife," he yelled when their eyes met, and the two ran towards each other as they waved across the crowd. The woman threw herself at her husband, sobbing, and the man couldn't help but shed tears as well. This seemed to trigger a whole set of reactions, and a few more found their relative, friend, or colleague. Sobs of joy from different directions soon echoed, and everyone started feeling antsy, hopping to experience the same luck. Very quickly, the temporary camp became even livelier, with people running about hopping to meet family. "Does anyone know?" a few people yelled, telling their own names in case someone recognized. Some people were enumerating the names of their loved ones and friends. Without exception, these people all went across the crowd, which would, considering their number, potentially lead to a stampede. The guards had to step up to keep the order. "Halt, everyone's going to the same destination. Please start your search after we enter the safety of the walls," Drake yelled, and the others echoed. It was inevitably a little chaotic, but they did follow in the end. What if they injured themselves and a mob came? What did that achieve? It took a while for everyone to settle down. Who could blame them? The possibility of finding family in the crowd right in front of them could make anyone's blood boil. Of course, most people weren't so lucky to find someone, but just the possibility alone made this trip worth it. And the fact that they could travel to and fro 3 territories without having to fear for their lives gave them enough hope for the future. And that was already something to celebrate together. Thanks for watching. Please sub and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story.